everyone, welcome to this episode 14, I believe. Yeah, episode 14 of the LLP podcast. I'm James, and today I'm joined by Chris, who wrote a article for us. Remember, we have three different types of submissions at LLP. We have the playgrounds, the walkthroughs, and the articles, and today Chris is going to be talking about his article titled, let me get the title here. It's quite a long title. On the similarities of, one second. There it is. On the similarities of slaying dragons and ordering food. So from the title, we can get the idea that this is going to be about maybe role-playing and maybe task-based teaching. And so I'm going to be asking Chris about his Ludic, his language, and his pedagogical focus in the paper, as well as his kind of best bits. And we're also joined by the lovely reviewers here. We had three reviewers for this paper. We had Jake, Rob, and Rose. So we're going to be asking them for a brief comment about what they thought about the paper. And yeah, let's get started. So Chris, tell us about yourself. Where are you from and why did you write this paper? Let's start there.
So I'm from Germany, and I decided to become a German language teacher when I was living in Japan. I was working at an English conversation lounge, and it kind of made me happy to see when people started to understand something like that small light bulb that is going on, this being switched on the moment you explain something. And so it led me to studying German as a foreign language, and I ended up in Korea. And yes, about the Ludic part, so I'm focusing on tabletop role-playing games, which are basically a mixture of board game, cooperative storytelling, and theater.
Mm-hmm.
So
did you get into TRPGs before language teaching, or was it after language teaching? How does that work?
Yes, I actually, when I was, I think 11 years old, I moved from northern Germany to southern Germany. I was pretty shy student. I had a mild stutter, and I ended up in one of the board game clubs in my town, and they offered some RPG rounds, and actually they helped me to get rid of the stutter, and they helped me develop a mindset of actually becoming more outgoing and standing up for what I believe in, and just experiencing different roles helped me to prepare myself for daily life. And when I was in college, I was invited to a DSA, which is Das Schwarze Auge, the Black Eye. It's a German role-playing game focusing on medieval contents, and I was invited to a group that was related to one of my good friends, and there was a Bulgarian guy who actually learned German through it, and who felt that he improved his German language skills tremendously through playing role-playing games. And this kind of got me on the idea of using role-playing games for language learning.
Amazing. I think the last time we did a podcast was basically Jake's paper, which was looking at TRPGs in the Japanese, my EFL classroom, so English as a foreign language classroom. So we seem to have a lot of, and I know Rob has done some work, hasn't published anything for LLP yet, but I know he's done some work.
I've got something in mind. it's coming down the pipe.
So we have some similarities here, and it seems that these kinds of papers, seems that the world has finally kind of clicked onto the fact that maybe TRPGs and language learning are, linked very, very closely. So I think that, your paper here, Chris, is kind of a stake in the sand to say, these are the exact similarities, go do it kind of thing, right? Is that fair to say?
Yes, that was my intention, actually. Because so far I haven't read Jake's and Rob's paper when I was coming up with the idea of comparing TBLT to TRPG, but from the papers I saw, it was mostly some projects that were more or less successful, but just an underlying structure of how to implement them pedagogically was missing. So that is what I wanted to provide. I found out that Rob as well as Jake did the same for other theories, but I've only discovered your papers later on. So from what I've discovered before, it seems like there were a couple of lone wolves fighting, and there needed to be some connection and groundwork established, and that was what I was trying to do with task-based language teaching.
Nice. Okay, I got a couple of questions regarding the language side of things then.
Sure.
So let's start with, well, I guess it's a fairly simple question to answer, but maybe not at the same time. What language skills do you think TPRGs are particularly geared towards teaching or, helping students with? What language? It could be anything, but particularly this. What do you think, guys? I'll ask this to everybody. So starting with Chris then. What do you think? In terms of language, what are the benefits of TRPGs?
So I think the really interesting thing about TRPG is that you control everything through your language. So you're describing the characters, you're describing your experiences as a player, you're describing the game system, and you're also embodying the character. So there's a very large language part. And so basically what I think you can is that you can simulate almost every real life situation through TRPG. So you can virtually simulate any occasion in which you could or would use language.
Yeah, I think if we think about the 4 language skills, obviously TTRPGs lend themselves a lot more to the oral language skills, but I've experimented a lot with having students do written and reading things that align with those same tasks. And I've studied TTRPG game sessions and what kind of languages students spontaneously and naturally produce. And it really matches well up with intermediate and advanced level tasks from the actual speaking proficiency scale. So I think that they're really targeting, as Chris says, practical, real life language tasks.
There's an interesting paradox in a way then. I know this is mentioned in Chris's paper, but this idea of authentic or real world language use. Now, ostensibly, we're in a extremely unreal situation in these often fantasy worlds, right? So how do you square this hole? How do you get this? How do you get the real world language use, but it's a fantasy world? What is the connection there? How do you make that right?
This is going to be a little bit of a long explanation, but let's start with what my Professor Herman Funk, told me, and he's an expert on authentic tasks, and his definition of authentic is something is authentic if the learners believe it is authentic. So, not if it's actually authentic materials. And what also brought me towards the idea that TRPG can be considered authentic is were some works from Scandinavia. Scandinavia is very much invested into educational LARP, so live action roleplay.
Right.
They
Nordic
have
LARP,
conferences
right?
there,
Yeah.
exactly, Nordic LARP, and I read some papers from there, and I think it was Eric Fedland who worked on interaction codes, and he claims that even when we go to the fantasy genre, we end up using interactional codes and interactional patterns that are human in itself. That, for instance, if we go to a medieval setting, we even if it's fantasy or Lord of the Rings, we still use some kind of medieval language or what we perceive to be fit in a historic setting. So even in those cases, you might use authentic language.
So I've also got my own ideas about this, and it's been written in a few papers in the past that the task that you're undertaking, if it's meaningful to you, then it's authentic, essentially, right? If regardless of the setting, if it's fantasy or not, if you're invested in that as a genuine, authentic thing, then it's going to feel real to you. So, and like you said, you're using real world, you're using a language, so as long as it feels meaningful and authentic to you, then yeah, it can be considered authentic, I think. Any other comments on that? The idea of the language?
I think the tasks are definitely authentic, right? Asking questions, clarifying, describing people, places, things, negotiating, planning.
Yeah.
These are all things that we do outside of the game.
Yeah.
Now, there are some things that sometimes my students will encounter specific vocabulary words that they might not use outside the game, like cauldron, magic spell. But you could pre-teach those if you wanted, or just as they arise, you know. And especially when I'm teaching online, then we Google a picture of it, right? And we learn what it is together.
Yeah.
But I think that the tasks, the type of tasks, even if the specific vocabulary might not always be as relevant.
You know, it reminds me also that if a student is reading a book or watching a series or a movie, in a genre like a fantasy one, a movie isn't authentic, you know, it's not authentic because it's modern language, because you can use in the real world now. And in my view, it's authentic because that's what we encounter on our daily lives, right? Like, I watch a lot of fantasy genre for Chinese and Korean. So, you know, it's the kind of language that I encounter on my entertainment, daily basis. So I need to be able to understand and talk about what the things I like, you know. So I think in a sense, it's still authentic.
Yeah, that's true.
Even if the genre is fantasy, it doesn't mean modern in terms of like contemporary kind of language, right?
Yeah. Perfect.
That's my take on it.
Brilliant.
And I would like to add to what Rob said, because that's exactly what drama pedagogy says. They basically say then that if you read a script, if you play theater, if you're actually joining in a play, then maybe you're not faced with authentic language, but you're faced with authentic situations. Because if a drama is odd, if we don't understand, if the communicational patterns and the tasks and challenges are odd and not understandable by means of the audience, then nobody will actually watch the theater piece. So
I think that
while
go on. Sorry. Yeah.
So while the language might be of course unnatural because we're trying to follow a rhyme scheme or just whatever, but essentially it's still focusing on real life human interaction and real life human problems, and it presents us with modes in which those problems were solved. So actually I think the same goes for TRPGs. And I think that's the same what Rob was aiming for, right?
I got a couple of questions then regarding this. I did have. Maybe they've gone now. Well, let's talk about the pedagogy then, very briefly. Oh, Rob, if you wanted to add, yeah.
I was just going to say, I think one of the great things that Chris's paper does, and this is a problem I had as I was writing about this and getting it published in a journal, writing about my use of TTRPGs, is some of the reviewers thought it was great, and one of the reviewers says, "What is this? Like, what is the pedagogical foundation or pillar that this is based on?" And I couldn't really explain it very well. And they said, well, you ought to take a look at task-based language teaching. And I think that, that's when I've encountered some of the papers that you wrote, James, about this iterative model and preparing students for gaming. And that's where it really solidified to me that really this is task-based language teaching.
Yeah.
And so Chris's paper does a great job at helping us understand how we can use task-based language teaching as a model for structuring our paper. And I think that that's really important thing that we need to communicate when people use this. We're not just having fun. We're following a tried and tested model for how language is learned. But we're having fun doing it.
One thing I might like to add here in terms of task-based stuff is that a TRPG, and please tell me if you have a different view on this, is that it offers a space to create an emergent narrative. So whereas when you go into the classroom as a teacher, you might have a plan laid out what you're going to teach that day, just in a traditional classroom, and what you hope the students are going to accomplish by the end of it. Now you do that as a dungeon master too, but it's a smaller group, right? You're not DMing or being a dungeon master for 30 people probably. It's usually between 3 and 5 people, and those people are in constant communication with one another. The groups are, because it's a smaller group, they're tight knit. They each have their own powers and abilities. They're all kind of vital to what's going on in the situation. So in that case, you don't really know what the players are going to do. So you could set a task for them and they could solve it or not. You don't even know. But they're still solving it linguistically. Whether maybe the characters fail, but they're still going through the speech acts and the verbal motions, the language, to try and accomplish something. So it's really an interesting genre, I think, to be exploring right now.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that is one of the hurdles for people. I think there's two major hurdles for people that want to perhaps integrate a TRPG into their classroom. The one that you're mentioning here is the fact that a teacher may feel out of their depth, that I don't know what language is going to emerge. So how do I know what to prepare? And how do I deal with all of these groups that may have different language points? That's the first one, I think. And that's what I've tried to show in my own context, is that students analyze their own language and find their own problems, okay? Because you can't plan for all the problems that students have. So you need to get it much more student-centered and say, okay, look at what you did. Where are your problems? Once you've identified the problems, then as a teacher, we can look at, maybe some grammar points or some errors that you've got, and we can look at it together, but it becomes a lot more student-centered, right? I think that's the first major problem or at least that's how pedagogically you can scaffold this kind of reactive pedagogy, like looking at what happened post-play, if you like. And then the second point here is, I think that maybe I'll ask this to everybody, especially those that have experience teaching with TRPGs, is that, well, how do I bring a TRPG into a class of 30?
Well, first, I just want to respond to what
Sure.
you said there, their own language. When I first started teaching TTRPGs, we'd have sessions, and I knew they used language, and I could find evidence because we'd have recordings that they used language, but I wasn't sure that they were getting better. And so that's when I needed to implement the iterative model that you've used in some of your articles, where I have students go back, look at transcripts of it, and analyze where did they do well and where do they need to get better. And often it involved them having to say, here was kind of not just the language goal, but really this was the communicative goal of the experience. Did you and your team solve it? And if not, what do you need to solve it? And then give them another opportunity to go back, maybe a different content, but similar kind of task. Well, as far as dealing with a large group, this is something I'm grappling with. And I've tried this for the first time, where I gave students kind of like a mini guide to what the problem was. And so one student in the group has this mini guide, and I coach them, okay, here's the problem, here's the things, maybe the obstacles they're going to encounter. You decide when they've accomplished things so you can move the narrative along. And I think that's maybe one interesting approach to do it. And it worked okay with my class, but I've been thinking about more of an information gap kind of approach to TTRPGs, where I give each student some information. Now they've got to solve a problem, but they don't know who has the rest of the information they need to solve the problem. And that way it's kind of a DM-less TTRPG, but they do still have to work together, and they don't have all the information when they start.
Any other comments, guys?
So I faced the first problem that you mentioned, James. At first, when I started the TRPG club, my initial objective was to find out how my students would fare in an authentic TRPG setting.
Right, similar to Jake then, right? Yeah.
So, and it didn't go that well, and I ended up.
What can you verbalize what didn't go well?
They often grasped for words, and I felt that they there needed to be some pedagogical implementation, I started to anticipate vocabulary that would fit for the next session, but then my students would end up deciding to take an entirely different route, and yeah, so it was not the way to go. And then I discovered your paper in I think Hayo Reinder's publication on new teaching trends in Japan. And I found your paper, and that was the moment where I actually found the connection to a strong TBLT approach. So that actually, rather than anticipating, we should be analyzing what was said instead of anticipating what could be said in the next session, because this is not really working well with TRPG, because then we would be what is called railroading the adventure. So we would kind of pull our students through the adventure instead of giving them the main role and the function to co-narrate how the plot is going, and it worked out pretty well. And what Rob said, and I also discovered that with some of the papers I've read, that often students ended up using a more simplistic language when they were using the TRPG, because I think they were faced with stressful situations because they had to improvise, and the dice can always make you it can always force you to just give up anything you have planned. And this kind of makes students use a more simplistic language than they could probably use in a normal language class, when they have the time to prepare and to collect the vocabulary, to conceptualize what they wanted to phrase out. And there again, analyzing their patterns of speech helped them to improve their speech for the next time, because as Rob said before, the tasks kind of they don't stay the same, but they reoccur. So we have to negotiate, we have to argue, we have to defend our opinion continuously throughout the adventure. So there will be new chances to actually use the language again, and when we analyze it properly and we train it properly, then they might memorize it, and they can recall, and it becomes more frequent in their memory, so they can recall it quicker, and they don't have to conceptualize it, but just use it.
Yeah, a couple of comments on that. You mentioned that during this kind of authentic task of playing a TRPG, students' language might be quite short and stinted and less than you'd expect from a textbook. Here's a conversation, fill in the blanks and do it with your partner, right? Yeah. Okay. I think that's not just it's not a TRPG issue. You find the literature on task-based language teaching that because it's meaning focused, as long as the meaning is expressed and understood by the partner, then it doesn't matter how short the sentence is. And this is quite one of the things about task-based language teaching. Tasks themselves is that in the post-task, then where we can focus on accuracy, we can then perhaps promote a longer expression in a report phase or something like this. Okay, so yeah, I think that's not really an issue as long as that kind of post-task give me your longer answer now kind of accuracy focus is fine. Okay, I'm going to jump into about 20 minutes in now. I'm going to jump into just what are your maybe top 3, or I don't know, just what are some of the connections between TRPGs and TBLT for you, Chris, and others? What do you think that the main kind of connections here are?
So I think I would go for meaningfulness.
Okay.
And
so a meaning focus, or
it's a meaning focus, and it's perceived meaningful by the players. And also the quest orientation, I think, is something that you can really compare well with TBLT. With meaningful, with tasks being meaningful, I mean, we've talked about this before, with the interactional patterns and with tasks reoccurring, and that even though we use use maybe not modern language, we still use authentic tasks.
Right.
We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
And also, as I found out in some of the works on people who were actually analyzing the narrative structures of certain game systems, that usually game designers borrow from historic contents, from historic context, like warfare in The Black Eye is borrowed from some of the medieval principles of warfare. So actually, some of the creators looked into historic context, and also with the languages, they borrowed languages from real life, from real languages.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some authentic historical context actually flowing into the game system,
Right.
which you could also use, for instance, for comparison. Then it's perceived meaningful by the students because I think the major points are that we have an interesting storyline that they can influence by themselves, and this is what the German researcher Laura Flöter is saying. She makes the connection of immersing yourself into the storyline and the storyline being interesting. So when I plunge deeper into my character, I perceive the storyline as more interesting. I perceive it more realistically, which in turn lets me dive into the character even deeper.
Right.
So this is, I think, one of the key issues with meaningfulness, because you dive into the character and the character has to survive. So you have to survive.
Yeah.
Because you're in the character.
So there's kind of you get invested in it, right? You get
Exactly
invested in the character. Yeah, interesting.
Exactly.
Rather
you start
rather than what we just mentioned about, let's say you've got a conversation on page 3 and it's fill in the gaps for your own context. That then it's done and over in like one session. Something like this that has multiple sessions. You can get invested and yeah.
Exactly, and
Great.
you're not only getting invested, you're actually perceiving things from a character perspective. This is what is called bleed in or bleed out in the Nordic LARP sphere, which is basically that attitudes or values or learning contents can actually move from the character to the player or vice versa. And I've experienced that when I was doing LARP. I had people who were friends in real life, but enemies in character, and after a LARP event, they would just cease any contact for a week. And I also had this with one of my adventures that I was playing. There was some kind of like algae monster located in southern German, Lake Constance, that was trying to find a host and get to another place to connect with its mother alien. And one of the students afterwards told me that she couldn't eat miso soup for a week because she was scared of algae. So actually the fear she got from she experienced as a character actually caused some distaste in one of her favorite foods for a week.
The power of TRPGs, guys.
Yeah. It's immersion.
Wonderful. All right.
Well, I think Chris has highlighted, those good packs of interaction, communication, meaningful goals, even the learner-centeredness. And those are all things I think pretty naturally happen in a TTRPG session. What doesn't naturally happen in a TTRPG session is the focus on form. But that, I think, works in very well, whether it's beforehand and you talk about here's some kinds of language structures that may be useful during the session, or as it comes also post session when students analyze their performance and then they focus on form. So I think that's something that really the task-based language learning and teaching adds to TTRPG that's not already there, is the focus on form. Because most gaming sessions don't stop and say, hey, how did we do? How well did we communicate with each other? So, but that is something that we need to train students to do. Otherwise, they're not as likely to notice and improve as a result of the experience.
Absolutely love that, Rob. Yep, that's a great point. That's where the teacher comes in, bit of didactic help for the students there to say, you know, you played well, but actually this is actually a learning task. Don't forget, guys, we're trying to learn language here, and these are the things that I noted, and let's focus on these for next session. Yeah, so the TBLT wrapper really helps bring out the accuracy, the focus on accuracy there. So yeah, wonderful. All right, I'm going to move on to last couple of points here now. I know we're a little bit quick, and we could probably keep talking about this, but I'm a bit of a stickler for getting things done quick, you know. So to Chris, then, what is your kind of your best? What's the most? What's the biggest takeaway from the paper for you?
So, although the paper was actually focused on comparing TBLT and TTRPG, actually what I'm most proud of is actually the connection between having established the connection between narration, play, and game, because I think this is something crucial for language teachers who want to use it, because on the one hand, I think the use of D20 systems, so using just a 20-sided dice and or Dungeons and Dragons, is predominant. So, and Dungeons and Dragons is more focused on game characteristics, but there are also TRPGs out there that focus rather on play, or that focus rather on an epic plot, and depending on what you try to achieve, it's not only about the game part. It's also about, you could also use TRPG as improvisational theater. You could also use TRPG as storytelling, and for instance, comparing your story to an actual work of literature. You could, for instance, confront students with a Faustian pact from Goethe's Faust, and then compare how their characters decided with the way it worked out with Dr. Faust and Mephisto. So there's much more to be done and to be explored with TRPG, and actually I think the drama part is really crucial for comparing it to TBLT, because we are already using role plays in TBLT, but so and what was missing from, I wouldn't say missing, but most of the projects focused more on having students explain what their characters are doing instead of diving into their character, and this is perfectly fine. I mean, that's another task, to describe actions. But I think through establishing the three key elements of TRPG, I hope that I could inspire some of the researchers or teachers to try out going a little bit more into narration and drama and find out how that part is working.
Yeah, I have to admit that's definitely one of the interesting parts of your paper, the deep look at narration and from the improvisational theatre side of things. And I know that there's some work being done. I was speaking to a colleague the other day about improv and how that and improv for language learning. So to take away a focus on the D20 game side of things and more towards the play and the character building narration is definitely a nice take of the paper. Yeah, I agree. Wonderful. All right, reviewers, one at a time. Key takeaways. What do you think? We'll start with Jake.
Yeah, so I just want to say that I really appreciate Chris's contribution here, because as he said, it's contributing to the fundament, the theoretical fundament of what I do in the classroom. So I was looking through Chris's literature review, and so many of them I had never heard of. And then I'm just reminded, I guess I'm more of a gamer than a researcher. But yeah, I just really appreciate that, and the very academic focus that was taken here. It just also demonstrates that, you know, you can research games. You can be very academic about them. And that's something that is, not necessarily, well, we take it for granted as gamers that, of course, you can. But there's a lot of maybe non-gamer researchers, they're into something else, and they hear the word game and they think, oh, that's a waste of time, or that's not really something that we should be considering deeply. And Chris's paper, I think, flies in the face of that and gives us an example of that. Yes, you can take these things very seriously if you want to.
Cool. Nice. Yeah, again, that's probably because of Chris's focus on from the side of drama and improv and theatre studies that really brings a fresh look to this. Flies in the face of I don't want to be too rude, but digital game-based learning, this topic that comes up over and over again.
Yeah, that too. There's lots of focus on digital games, and they're bigger, right? There's a much bigger market there. If you're talking just sheer amount of money in the industry. But yeah, there's why are tabletop RPGs still here so many decades later? And it's because of these kinds of in-person affordances that they have, I think.
And to be honest, I mean, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but a lot of teachers can't bring digital games into the classroom. It's tricky still. So for just literally a couple of sheets of paper and some dice and have a wonderful experience, then yeah. Anyway, I won't go any deeper into that. Rob, what do you think?
I think what's great is that connection, obviously, to task-based language teaching that gives a justification. But also, I think in his discussion of weak and strong, he's shown that there isn't just one way to do tabletop role-playing game in the classroom. There's lots of ways you can implement elements of it. You could go full-blown with a normal gaming session, or you could bring in smaller parts of it. So, I think it's important to have a goal in mind, but also to test it and adjust it. I mean, that's certainly what I've done with TTRPGs in the classroom. Is every time I teach a course, I make changes to it, and might this work better, and might this work better, and I do it both face to face and I do it with online live Zoom sessions with students, and I think it can work in both contexts.
Great, awesome. Rose, what have you got for us?
Well, I read the paper from the perspective of a teacher who actually didn't have any experience with TRPG. So I really thought the paper, as I read it, I became more interested in the application in education, right? Also, I learned about it, something that I hadn't really given myself any time to learn. So that was an opportunity, and I was really it was really nice with the TBLT comparison because it gave me some foundation. I'm specialized in using TBLT. I know how to do that well, but so it gave me some foundation to understand better the application of TRPG, and that's what I appreciated the most, because if you are a teacher and you're coming in to read the paper, you have no clue. Also, even if they don't know anything about TBLT, still there are some foundation of TBLT laid down there for us to read. So I think that was really great, and I really appreciated being able to review it. Thank you.
That's a fantastic take, actually. I hadn't considered that. The fact that maybe teachers are more familiar with TBLT than they are TRPGs. So for you TRPG players, it's like, oh, we're coming from this knowledge and into, oh, look, the pedagogical link is here. But for maybe some teachers, it goes the other way. It's, oh, I know the pedagogy. I know about TBLT. I don't know anything about TRPGs. Oh, that's how it connects. Oh, that's a really nice take. I hadn't considered that. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one last question. Oh, go on, sorry.
And just sorry. It's just, it's leaving the story. That's the beauty of it, And when you think of TBLT, it's also simulating living that situation. So they connect really nicely together. Yeah, in my view.
Just ask one more question, then we're going to wrap this up. But so TRPGs, where should we start, Chris? As someone like me and Rose, we don't really use TRPGs in our own teaching context. Where do we start?
That's a tough question. I would say start by finding a system that might suit your students well. Because I'm teaching German, I'm a little bit afraid of going too deep into the fantasy genre because I think it's a little bit easier with the English context because you have a lot of gamers out there, so they might know some of the fantasy vocabulary, sword, potion, spell. They might know that from all their MMORPGs, but in the case of German, that's all new territory. So I try to stick through investigative role-playing games, especially to Cthulhu because Cthulhu uses the real world,
Right.
and it's okay if students don't know anything about the fantastic parts because that's what Cthulhu intends to.
Mm-hmm.
Should be surprised when you discover a monster because you would never imagine that monsters even exist. So this is why I would recommend if you're not sure about the fantastic elements for Cthulhu, you can even turn Cthulhu into only detective elements without any occult items. You could also go for D20 systems, and if you don't feel comfortable with going for a large-scale TRPG project, you could always connect it to a weak TBLT approach. This is what one of my German colleagues in Japan did. He works, I think, at Aoyama Gakuin University, and
Good uni.
I don't know, but he used a weak approach without knowing that he used a weak approach. I'm explaining to him right now that he used a weak approach, so I'm actually connecting him to TBLT right now. But he used a normal language class and he implemented a small TRPG session at the end of every class for like 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a good start to get familiar with TRPG and also to get the students to become familiar, not to just switch from maybe a more introduction related class to immersing them into improvisational theater without anything in between. Maybe start out using some small scale TRPG elements. You could even go for some gamification characteristics, which I just found a week ago, I think. So they would basically just create character sheets, those researchers, and use them in a normal textbook-driven class.
That could work.
Those are some low threshold ways, I think, of engaging into TRPG without actually being a TRPG expert. Or gamer, for that matters.
All right. And you can start by reading Chris's paper. Right?
Sure.
All right. Anybody got any shout outs? Any thanks? Thanks, Mum. Thanks, Dad. Anything like that, Chris? Who do you want to acknowledge?
So, of course, thanks for the very nice review. It was probably the friendliest review that I've ever received. Usually German review is just that out. Need that unnecessary wrong. Read again. So I was very, very motivated to actually edit the paper because the review was very constructive and made a lot of suggestions how to improve the paper. And of course, with all the spelling issues, I mean, I'm not a native speaker, and German uses tons of comma, so thank you for going through that as well. And then again, it was a really huge help was my university that gives me it's not a fund, but we can order books for for the library for around I think 300,000 yen.
Mm-hmm.
So that was actually a huge help as well. So I could order some of the books that I couldn't get in any other way. So, and of course, thanks to my students who, through all the strange pedagogical experiments I did in order to come up with a theory.
Excellent. All right. I think we'll call it a day.
I think that's a great idea for anyone here. Just kind of another paper, that this idea of putting maybe a compilation of resources for folks like James and Rose who maybe haven't used TRPGs in the classroom extensively. Is it something like really small, like at the end, the week TBLT that you mentioned? Especially even for people like me, I think that's useful because when I go into D&D or a tabletop game, my idea switches to, oh, everything is going to be that. Like, there's no like light mode in my head when I go into these things. But maybe I should take a step back and think like, maybe my whole class doesn't want to go hardcore on this just yet. So that might be a good idea.
I mean, I'm working on a paper in German right now, and I think I could translate it into a playground item for the English-speaking world. So I'm making a compilation of different ways how to integrate TRPGs into the classroom based on the degree of authenticity.
Sounds good.
Sounds
Maybe
like a very, very good
could
one.
be another playground.
Looking forward to it.
Me too.
All right. Again, thanks everyone for taking time out of your day to chat with us. I hope you guys also got something out of this conversation, maybe inspired to do some more work in this area. Yeah, reviewers, again, I'll just echo Chris. Thank you so much for all of your hard work on the open peer review process at LLP. Not the smoothest of things sometimes, but definitely humanistic. So yeah. I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks, guys. And hopefully speak to you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.